911, what's the address of your emergency?
Come on. I'm having a heart attack. We've been shot.
What is your name, sir?
John was a little bit different. Not what I pictured my mom to ever date, not a people person.
You always want to see the good in people. But I felt something's a little off here.
We would question, like, what's going on with him? He became a completely different person.
I thought, wow, he's definitely getting obsessed with this. And then that's where everything took a big, terrible turn.
Where are you at?
We're in the basement.
There was a makeshift bookshelf that had been turned into a door into like almost a hidden room.
Where were the guys at when the shooting started? In the basement.
His demeanor, his actions, his emotions, they just weren't genuine.
It's Christmas Day in the D'Amico household.
I can't see.
42-year-old Steve has an unusual present for his 41-year-old wife, Carla.
Something out in the garage.
Sure, it's cold. My dad said Santa left a present out in the garage, and me and my mom went out there.
Turn on the light. What is it? Santa left a package.
Carla got a garage door opener from her hubby.
Yeah, really.
Oh, yeah. It was practical.
Thank you, Santa.
They were married. Had to be about 22 years, somewhere around there. And at this point, Carla and Steve's marriage was probably starting to go downhill. I think it had been brewing for a while, and sometimes you stay together for the children. I think that might have been part of the situation. He was a good dad, but maybe not quite up there doing everything like Carla. She ran circles around him, made sure everything was in order.
They were young when they got together, and I didn't see my parents give much affection to each other. I feel like they had a good relationship as friends.
I remember my mom saying that she still loved my dad, but she wasn't in love with him anymore.
Carla and Steve divorced in 2007.
Steve did not want the divorce, but because of their 2 children and all the grandchildren, they were very nice to each other, very civil.
So after the divorce, it was like a new chapter, and she just was like feeling good about herself. I think she was reliving some of her younger years that she missed because she was 21 when she got married.
Carla begins online dating.
I was always a little apprehensive about meeting people on this, dating website. Not too many months after, she told me that she met a really nice guy and that she was enjoying talking with him.
The new man in Carla's life is 40-year-old John Benton Lewis.
He was a little bit different. Not what I pictured my mom to ever date. She showed me his profile with like weed plants. I would never picture her being with someone that did that. But here she is in her 40s, wanting to kind of relive those 20s again.
John had tattoos. He had a motorcycle, and he was good at fixing things.
He was a man of few words, but she enjoyed his company. She was very happy with him.
John would cook, and he would clean, and he would fix things around the house. I think that's what she was looking for.
He made her feel very good, made her feel very important. Something that she never, ever, ever had in her past life. My sister told me that he did have a criminal past. He did have a felony for burglary. But she did say that he had changed and was getting away from all of that stuff. And I said, well, you know better than anyone.
John told my mom that he had had cancer previously, and he had a lot of pain from that. John was on disability income, and that and the small engine repair was what he considered his income.
John had a medical marijuana card, and he did smoke the marijuana because he was in pain, because the cancer that he had. I felt like it was excessive, but it is used for medical things. I get that. So yeah, I was very accepting to him.
He told my mom about the things that went on in his past, and my mom had a huge heart, and she always saw the potential in people, and I believe that she saw a big amount of potential in him.
The end of April 2009, and they were already living together.
My mom was very successful in her career. She was in the accounting area at Bayer Pharmaceuticals. In the summer of 2010, she bought a house in Niles for her and John. It was a 3-bedroom ranch style with a really nice sun porch on the back and a pool. My mom loved it.
Carla and John might be a tight couple, but John often ducks out of important family milestones, like the wedding of Carla's daughter, Danielle.
That's me and my dad. He's walking me down the aisle. Oh, there's my mom. She's super happy.
There's Carla right there, and Steve. They definitely were fine being around each other.
My wedding was in Idaho. My whole family came out to celebrate. It was just nice having my mom there for it. John was invited to the wedding, but he didn't come. My mom said that he doesn't like flying, doesn't like being around a bunch of people, but it's also because he couldn't just smoke his weed whenever he wanted.
Sometimes when you go away outside the state of Michigan, that would be frowned upon if you were someplace else and trying to do that. We got very used to John's excuses for why he wouldn't come. Carla would always have loved if John would have came with her, but she always told me she understood why he didn't, and she was fine with that. But she would call him a lot.
She'd go call him and come back in and be like, I think he misses me. When she got home, she'd say, look what Johnny got me. He would get her flowers. So it would kind of show like, oh, he does care, he's just quiet and not a people person.
Back home in Michigan, John makes up for his absences at family events by spending quality time with Carla's grandkids.
This is John on a go-kart pulling my 3 oldest boys on a sled. Noah's in the front, Adam's in the middle, and Isaiah's in the back.
He had wanted to do something with us because there was snow. I remember he would take us around the block.
When John was interacting with my kids, most of the time I was not there. I always assumed that it was because he was too introverted, but I don't really think he liked me very much.
Six months later, Carla and John tie the knot.
It was a outside little wedding with a little gazebo, just pretty much family, and it was wonderful.
He was probably going outside doing smoke breaks every 10 minutes. Him and his marijuana. He socially didn't like being around a bunch of people. He didn't seem like he cared enough to try to have a relationship with anyone.
That same year, John starts to grow cannabis plants at home in the basement.
We heard about a room that John had built. It was a grow room, and it was like behind a wall. I was a little apprehensive about it. I was thinking, I don't like that my sister has this in her house. I thought at this time that he was just growing that medical marijuana for him. And then all of a sudden I heard that he was actually growing it not just for him, but other people.
He would post about it on Facebook too, to show that he supports cancer patients with marijuana, and he'd be cooking tablets for like cancer patients.
Carla is very trusting, so if he says he can sell it to medical people, she can see the good in that. I was thinking, I'm not really sure about this because he had a felony, and when you have a felony, I'm not really sure if you're supposed to be selling the medical marijuana to other people.
By 2016, John had become quite outspoken about wanting the legalization of marijuana to happen.
John got his truck all decked out. I mean, he seemed super proud of it.
This is John's truck that's got the marijuana leaf on the front and on the windows. And there's the phrase on the back that cannabis cures 7 leaves. If a law is unjust, a man is not only right to disobey, he is obligated to do so. A quote by Thomas Jefferson. I thought, wow, he's definitely getting obsessed with this.
John takes his advocacy for medical marijuana to the streets.
This was a Cannabis Cures motorcycle rally. That's probably John's bike right there because it was the same color green. He was known around the town on his motorcycle and on his truck. I think he took on the role of being the main person, the kingpin on vocalizing about legalizing marijuana. It was just getting a little bit out of control, and I just felt like, wow, you're really crossing some lines on doing this the right way.
Christmas of 2016, me and my family were staying with my mom and John at their house in Niles.
This was the first Christmas that we were spending together with all of the grandkids.
We'd always be on Snapchat doing Snapchat filters. And my mom, she'd just be like doing the goofiest Snapchats.
I decided to do my makeup different today. What do you think? How's it look?
Oh my goodness.
Hi, Nellie. Can you say hi?
My mom loved having all her grandkids and all her kids. It just was her favorite thing in the whole world.
It's Christmas time, but John was a little bit more off than he usually is.
People would come over, and they would come over when we were there. And I'd ask my sister, so who are they? And she's like, well, there's some of the, people that he sells his medical marijuana to.
I have my kids with me, so I'm a little more on like edge, like, who are these people, like random people coming in here, because they just didn't look like they were here for anything good. It just seemed like it was happening more frequent and like at nighttime. I'm not naive about things, whereas like my mom, she's more of a don't ask, don't tell. And I asked her, I was like, do you have a gun? She was like, no, I don't have one, but I think John does. It scared me for my mom, really.
In May of 2017 is when John opened his Seven Leaves Compassion Club store. Whatever you could sell for marijuana, as long as it was legal, he was selling it. Carla put forward the finances. She thought it sounded like a good thing.
My mom was very supportive of him because that's something that he had dreamed about doing.
Within the next couple months, Carla started sharing with us that she wasn't feeling too good about this shop. John doesn't hardly come home till late at night. He's there all day and all night, and even on the weekends. He's just not caring about anything except these drugs. Then all of a sudden, there was women that were texting him, and women, that were coming up there, regulars, and she wasn't feeling comfortable about that at all either. I think at this point, Carla was getting very frustrated with things. I know they were having conversations about that they were going to have to close that shop because they were losing money. He was very upset about what she was saying because he was having the time of his life right now. He was the center of attention with all the marijuana people in Niles and had all these girls calling him for different reasons and didn't want to get off that pedestal, that's for sure.
Carla drives 2 hours to Muskegon to look after her mom over the weekend.
My mom took my boys up there to help Grandma with all sorts of things in her little apartment.
She was sick or had just had surgery or something. And so we just went up there to help her. It was like how a normal weekend with her would go. But before we left, my grandma had been on the phone with somebody looking very angry and upset. And I remember asking her, if she was okay. And I remember her telling me that she was like, yeah, everything's fine. But like this was a different kind of upset and mad. It's like something had happened, something bad.
That afternoon, Carla drops her grandsons at Christy's house and heads home to John and Niles.
I believe it was like 4 o'clock. We all said goodbye, and I gave her a big hug. Never expected what happened next. Had I known, I wouldn't have let her go home.
What's the address of your emergency?
Come on. I'm having a heart attack. We've been shot.
Where are you at?
We're in the basement. They killed my wife.
Sir, what's your name? Hello? What is your name, sir? What's your last name?
Lewis.
Sunday, August 13th at approximately 5:45 p.m., 911 call was made by John Lewis.
I was probably 4 or 5 miles north when Our priority tones came out over the radio. It came out as a robbery in progress. We didn't know how many people were there. We didn't know who was involved. We didn't know how many people were still in the house. We grabbed our rifles. We didn't know what we were walking into. We started to search the main level, which was a single-story house with a basement. As we worked our way into the basement, you could start to hear that someone saying, like, she won't wake up, she won't wake up.
The voice is coming from behind a bookcase in the corner.
We made our way to that corner, and when we looked, there was a makeshift bookshelf that had been turned into a door, into like almost a hidden room. It was a hidden room where they were growing marijuana. We all got to this door and started announcing, saying, "Come on out." Mr. Lewis came crawling out. You could see he was covered in blood. Still in the room was a female. She was face down. She wasn't moving, unresponsive.
DOA, we're gonna need Frankie out here.
We had medic come down and pronounced Carla Lewis deceased at that point. One of my friends messaged me, "I'm just wanting to make sure that your mom's okay. I heard there was a shooting on her road." And I tried calling my mom and texting my mom. I tried calling John. I had woken my husband up. Like, I have to go over there. There was a line of cop cars blocking off their house. And I was like, no, it can't be her. It can't be her.
You're like numb, that's for sure. You can't even fathom it.
Couldn't like wrap my head around everything. Just didn't believe it. I was like thinking too, like, who would shoot my mom? Like, she's the sweetest, kindest person I've ever met in my life. I was just in complete shock.
We tried to get some basic information from Mr. Lewis. He had said that two big black guys essentially had come into his house, tried to rob him. They shot into his marijuana room, hitting Miss Lewis, missing him altogether.
We took Mr. Lewis to the Niles Law Enforcement Complex, where we could do a video interview with myself and Lieutenant Rick Biggard.
This is Stadium with the State Police. I'm Rick from the Sheriff's Department. We're both detectives. So we're trying to figure out what happened today, okay?
He was just wearing jeans and a pair of tennis shoes. We just kind of talked to him, get some basic information, kind of pin him down to a story. It said that Carla had gone to go visit her mother, so she was gone for the weekend. Then she had just arrived that Sunday afternoon. He said once she arrived, they never left the house. Nobody went anywhere. She basically shared her weekend of what she had did with him. They go downstairs into that grow room where the marijuana plants were.
Tell me what happened.
We were moving the plant. I bent over and she screamed. And when I looked up, I just seen guns going on.
So you're moving marijuana plants. Okay. Tell me what happened step by step and go really slow for me.
She said, "Where?" And I said, "Slide that one back by the wall." And I bent down to pull one. And it was just, it wouldn't stop. They just kept shooting into the room.
Who's they?
The guys, black guys.
How many guys?
I seen two guys. They didn't say nothing.
They're just
They
shooting.
just started shooting.
The grow room, it was very small, I want to say maybe it was 10 by 10, 10 by 12 with a small entrance door. You're looking at the casings, you're looking at holes in the wall. It gives you kind of an idea of what happened. My first thought is, okay, well, they killed her. How in the world did he escape harm? Because that doorway is so small. How did he not get injured?
Where were you guys at when the shooting started?
It had been in the basement.
So you're saying the suspects were already in your house?
They were in my house.
Then we're getting a little bit of history information about his business.
You have a store? What kind of business is that?
They for medical cannabis for caregivers.
Okay.
Then we asked him, does he have any enemies, things like that? Or is there anyone that he suspects of committing the homicide?
Everybody hated me up there.
Who was mad that you were...
The guys that had the one open the dispensary.
Who's they? Like, who are they? White guys? Black guys?
They're black guys.
Are they the same guys that were in your house today?
No.
We asked him if he suspected them of being involved, but he would never really give a straight answer on that.
Oh, that fucking store.
While detectives comb over John's story, deputies canvass for witnesses at the scene.
They go door to door asking about the vehicle. Did they hear anything? Have they heard a car speed away? Things like that, or if anyone saw Carla's car. And it wasn't that late in the evening when this was reported. I believe it was 5:30 in the evening. They couldn't find any neighbors that heard gunshots, saw any strangers sneaking around through the backyards. The next door neighbors, they did confirm through other officers that they could definitely hear the dogs barking all the time. If you got dogs that are constantly barking when you're there, you would assume that they probably barked when strangers came into the house. The story that John tells us just didn't make sense. We needed to find out the truth. We started to transition from a soft interview into an interrogation.
Do you have any guns in the house?
Nothing.
When's the last time you fired a firearm?
I haven't fired guns when I even got shot. I don't fuck with guns.
You got shot?
I got shot.
You get shot?
It was like the late 90s.
And he was adamant that he didn't have a gun, never owned a gun, never purchased a gun.
Have you and your wife been having problems at all?
No.
Not one?
Perfect.
Well, he was telling us that they had a happy marriage and that everything was great between them. Carla was happy, he was happy, and everything was great. Then he kept asking us if she was dead, if she was deceased, that he had to go see her.
Is my wife dead?
And John would just start blubbering.
She's not. No, she's not.
That's why we were talking.
No, she's not. I can't do this on my own.
All the information he's given us, it just doesn't jive. He just was sidestepping it. We needed to start putting pressure on John and see where it goes from there.
I guess the main question I have for you right now, would you do that to your wife?
Never.
Have you ever hit you?
Never.
You know I got a job to do. My job is to bring justice for your wife, okay? I want to eliminate you, so there's certain... If you guys got pissed, let me know. If some shit happened, you know what I mean? If things went haywire and it was an accident, you gotta let me know, man. Okay. You shouldn't have no gunshot residue on your hands at all, right? Okay. There's no weapons at all in your house? So I got a tech that can take samples off your hands. There won't be no gunshot residue. That's good. Okay. There may be a time where we have to go take a quick polygraph to make sure you're telling me the truth. Okay. We've got to eliminate you. Okay. I have to eliminate you. Because the only person I know at that house at that time is you. You know what I mean? You're there. Okay.
Around 9 o'clock, we received a call or a notification from dispatch that an individual named Justin Hicks.
It was Tula brand ammunition, which is steel casings. 9 out of 10 times, you're going to find brass casing at a homicide scene. The steel casing, well, that's kind of out of the ordinary. The ammunition that was given to us by Justin Hicks, it was the same caliber, same steel casing that is linked to the crime scene. It connected John Lewis to the homicide.
And he said, you don't own a gun? Never owned a gun, nothing. Don't keep them for security. Keep yourself safe at work or at home.
Once I got shot, I never messed with guns.
You got any ammo at the house or anything?
Once we received the text from the other officers of the individual who had come forward, we knew, okay, this is definitely, we're on the right track. He's definitely lying. So we confront him with that. We mentioned the name of Justin Hicks.
He works, he's doing that work for me in the other building.
Did you give him anything?
No.
Nothing? No. Didn't give him a bag? We're talking stuff right now. He says you gave him a bag.
And he saw no weed or nothing.
No, we're not talking weed. Some ammo. He says you met with him at 4:30 today. And you told him go to the shop, get a bag of ammo and magazines, which he has turned over to us. All right? This is your time to be honest. Things aren't adding up. Things aren't adding up at all.
I want away right now.
His demeanor was, okay, I'm not going to cooperate. All the blubbering stopped. He knew that he was in a bit of trouble now.
The autopsy occurred the next day. The results of the autopsy indicated that the type of bullets that had struck Carla Lewis matched the ammunition that Justin Hicks had turned over to the detectives. That gave us enough information to initially arrest John Lewis for killing Carla Lewis.
Well, once you make an arrest of the suspect, you are still building a case to try to convict, to convince a jury that this person is guilty. We're taking calls from witnesses, and we're getting that information, just trying to build the case even stronger. I personally spoke to one of the daughters. Carla had told her that she was under a lot of stress to bring money into the household because the business that John had opened up just wasn't making any money at all.
John's business was failing. John owed back rent and was in fact moving to a smaller location in the strip mall. Carla appeared to be the provider. According to her family, the financial strain really gave the notion that Carla was going to end John's business.
The only thing that was going to help John be a success was to have immediate access to money.
The family let us know that Carla had life insurance policy through her employer. In the event of Carla's death, John was the beneficiary of the life insurance policy that would pay John $334,000. Money could have been a motive for John to kill his wife.
One of the things that you do, obviously, in a crime scene is you collect all the electronic cell phones, laptops, things like that. John had deleted quite a bit of Facebook instant messaging. where he was making contact with several women. One female that had been contacted confirmed that she had been having an affair, extramarital affair with John for several months. She had asked John Lewis how attached he was with Carla Lewis. He had made the comment to her that they were going to be separated much sooner than she thought.
Another female had come forward who explains to us that John Lewis would pay her in cash and in marijuana to have sex with her, and that relationship had been going on for the previous 6 years. She had sex with John earlier in the day the incident had occurred. What's alarming is that John Lewis asked her if she would be his girlfriend and leave her boyfriend if he became a widower.
John Lewis had actually told her that he had thoughts or plans of killing Carla by using some type of prescription drug. It's had more information for the prosecutor to show that he did have motive, that he wanted to get rid of Carla. He wanted to move on with his life.
In looking through John's search history, detectives noted that approximately 10 days prior,
on the day of the homicide, after Carla arrived at the residence, John Lewis asked her to help him in that grow room, even though her family said that she would do nothing of the sort. That at that point in time, John Lewis murdered Carla Lewis by shooting her 5 times. After the fact it happened, that's when John Lewis called 911 to report that 2 males had come in.
I'm having a heart attack. I've been shot. They killed my wife.
The prosecution pointed out to the jury that this grow room was so small that it was almost impossible for John Lewis and Carla Lewis to be in there and then have 2 other males come in and commit this homicide. And there's just no way that could have happened. There's no way that John Lewis could have escaped being unharmed.
we built a scale model of the grow room that we used in trial for the jury to visualize how difficult it would have been for John to be right near the doorway and not been hit by any kind of fire.
Seeing the layout, you knew that the story that John Lewis was telling us was not credible at all. John Lewis had contacted Justin Hicks on the day of the homicide, asked him to go back to his business and to get this bag that was there and keep it for him, and that bag contained ammunition.
He says you met with him at 4:30 today, and you told him go to the shop, get a bag of ammo and magazines, which he has turned over to us, all right?
We had matched up the rounds to what Justin Hicks had turned over to what was on the scene. That was some damning information in this case.
I never would have thought that we let this monster live amongst us. Nothing will ever bring my mom back, and nothing will ever replace all the memories that she's missed. We'll always have an empty spot in my heart that is shaped like my mom.
I miss her so much. I never had like a relationship with anybody like I had with my mom. I hope I see her again and that she's proud of me.
Our lives are never the same. You can't ever go back to normal. But we try and remember the fun that we had together. Carla's memory can live on so easily because she's someone you can't forget.
In the Pacific Northwest, there were years when fear did not arrive all at once. It drifted in like weather. It moved through college towns and along highways, through parking lots and dormitory hallways, through the ordinary routines of young women who had every reason to believe they would make it home before dark. At first, it did not even seem like one story. It seemed like separate tragedies, disconnected disappearances, a string of small ruptures in otherwise normal days. A student left campus and did not return. A daughter said she would only be gone a short while. A friend noticed an empty seat in class, an unanswered phone call. A bed untouched through the night. There was no single explosion of horror at the beginning. No one moment when the country understood what it was facing. There was only a slow accumulation of absence. And in that absence, something far more terrifying began to take shape. Because what haunted these cases was not only the violence itself. It was the idea that the man responsible did not look like a monster. He did not move through the world like someone marked by darkness. He could smile. He could speak gently. He could seem embarrassed, polite, even wounded. He knew how to lower the guard of the people around him. He knew how to step into the frame of everyday life and belong there just long enough to do irreversible damage. That is where the story begins. Not at the end with handcuffs and headlines and courtroom photographs, but in the unsettling space before the name became infamous, when the threat was still invisible and the pattern had not fully formed. It begins in a country that liked to imagine evil as something obvious, something that announced itself in wild eyes and alleyway shadows. Not in a clean-cut young man with a cast on his arm, not in someone who could stand under the bright afternoon sun and ask for help in a voice so ordinary it disarmed suspicion. Before the world knew the name Ted Bundy, it knew the feeling he left behind. It knew the silence that follows a door that should have opened, but never did. It knew the strange, suspended hours when a family waits for news and tries to hold itself together by clinging to the smallest possible explanation. Maybe she lost track of time. Maybe the car broke down. Maybe she stayed with a friend and forgot to call. Every family begins there, at the edge of reason, before the darker possibility is allowed into the room. But once it enters, it changes the air. It settles over the table, over the telephone, over the eyes of the people who begin to understand that ordinary life has been split into two eras, the time before and the time after. In the years that followed, America would come to study Bundy with a kind of horrified fascination. His face would appear on television screens and newspaper covers. His voice would be analyzed, his posture interpreted, his lies replayed until they became part of the mythology that now clings to his name. He would become, in the public imagination, something larger than the sum of his crimes, transformed into a symbol of hidden predation, of charm weaponized, of brutality concealed behind intelligence and composure. But mythology is dangerous. It smooths rough truths into neat stories. It grants coherence where there was chaos. It risks pulling attention toward the killer and away from the people whose lives were stolen from, the center of their own stories. So before this narrative follows the investigation, before it tracks the manhunt across state lines, before the name becomes unavoidable, it must first slow down and stay with the world he entered and damaged. Because the true horror of this case lives not in the legend that grew afterward, but in the intimate scale of what happened. It lives in bedrooms left unchanged because mothers could not bear to move anything. It lives in campus bulletin boards crowded with missing person flyers. It lives in the brittle voices of friends trying to remember the last thing they said, as if memory might reveal a warning that was invisible at the time. It lives in lakeside parks, in dark roads, in the spaces between one plan and the next, where ordinary life kept unfolding even as danger moved quietly through it. He did not begin as a headline. He began as a stranger who knew how to look familiar. He understood something that many violent offenders never fully grasp, That trust is often not earned over time, but triggered in an instant by appearance, tone, and circumstance. A limp, a sling, an awkward request for assistance carrying books or loading a boat. A moment arranged to make another person feel not fear, but obligation. That was part of the horror. He did not always take by force at the first instant. He manipulated the social instincts that make daily life possible. Helpfulness, courtesy, the reluctance to seem rude, the belief that danger, if it comes, will look dangerous. And when that belief met him, it failed. The world he exploited was a world in motion. The 1970s carried with them a new sense of freedom for many young women, especially on college campuses. There was independence in the air, a widening sense of possibility. Women studied, worked, drove alone, made plans without asking permission, crossed campus after dusk, trusted the infrastructure of ordinary public life. Yet under that expanding freedom, there remained a set of cultural assumptions that made vulnerability easier to exploit. People were still taught to be accommodating, especially women. Suspicion could feel impolite. Refusal could feel like overreaction. Bundy slipped through those assumptions with terrifying ease. That is one reason his crimes struck such a deep nerve. They were not only acts of murder. They were violations of the invisible agreements that make a society livable. The shared expectation that a request for help is just that. The hope that daylight offers safety. The instinct to believe that a handsome, articulate young man belongs to the world of law schools, campaign offices, and respectable ambition, not to the hidden geography of abduction and death. In that contradiction lay the enduring shock. There is another reason this case still unsettles people decades later. It exposed how badly institutions can lag behind violence when violence refuses to fit the expected shape. Police departments worked within jurisdictions that often did not communicate well. Missing persons cases were handled separately. Witness descriptions sounded almost too ordinary to be useful. Young women disappearing from different places did not immediately resolve into a single, coherent image. Even when the name Ted surfaced in witness accounts, it was just a name, bland and common, easy to lose in the noise. The machinery of investigation, fragmented and human and fallible, struggled to catch up to a predator who kept moving. That delay widened the circle of damage. It allowed him time. And time in a case like this is not measured only in weeks or months. It is measured in opportunities taken, in warnings missed, in futures erased before anyone could stop what was happening. For the public, the fear deepened as the pattern emerged. This was not a single outburst of violence with clear boundaries. It was a sequence, a spread, a campaign of predation that crossed places and identities while maintaining its own terrible logic. Each new disappearance made the older ones feel even heavier. Each report sharpened the possibility that somewhere a man was not simply killing, but learning, adjusting, adapting, carrying a private hunger behind an increasingly polished mask. And as the case grew, so did the unsettling realization that the person responsible could stand in plain view and be dismissed as promising, likable, even admirable. That tension between surface and reality is what gives the Bundy case its lasting coldness. Many killers inspire fear because they seem savage. Bundy inspired a different kind of fear because he seemed legible, social, comprehensible on the surface, while underneath that surface there was an abyss. To understand the beginning of this story, imagine the atmosphere of those years before certainty hardened around his name. Imagine a mother staring out a kitchen window long after midnight, telling herself that headlights might still turn into the driveway. Imagine a campus where one missing poster becomes 2, then 3, and the casual rhythms of student life begin to buckle under the pressure of rumor. Imagine detectives with maps, photographs, timelines, scraps of witness memory. All of it suggestive, but not yet enough. Imagine the killer himself moving through these same spaces, self-possessed, alert, testing what he could get away with, discovering that appearance could buy him seconds. and seconds could buy him control. This was not chaos from his point of view. It was method. It was selection, approach, improvisation inside a pattern only he fully understood. And yet even he could not control the full consequence of what he was creating. Cases like this do not end when the act ends. They ripple outward into every life they touch. Parents age under the weight of unfinished grief. Siblings inherit silence. Friends learn that memory can become a permanent source of pain because it preserves the last unguarded version of the world, the version before danger revealed itself. Investigators carry photographs in their minds for years. Communities begin to look at ordinary gestures differently. A stranger asking for assistance is no longer simply a stranger. A parking lot at dusk no longer feels neutral. Fear becomes portable. It travels into habits, into warnings passed between friends, into the choreography of caution women teach one another every day. That legacy is part of the story too. Ted Bundy did not only murder individuals. He altered the emotional architecture of public trust. He entered American life as a hidden figure and left behind a permanent lesson in how deception can wear a human face. But at the beginning, no one sees the full shape of it. At the beginning, there are only fragments. A witness remembers a sling. Another remembers a cast. Someone recalls a tan Volkswagen. Someone else remembers a man who seemed almost too polished, too practiced, though not enough to justify alarm at the time. The details drift separately before they lock together. That is the hook in this story, and it is more unsettling than any scream in the dark. The terror did not first announce itself through spectacle. It arrived through normality, through the quiet confidence of someone who knew that if he looked harmless enough, the world itself would assist him. So when we step into this case, we do not step first into the courtroom or the prison or the mythology. We step into the shadow just before recognition, into the years when young women vanished into the blank space between expectation and nightmare, when the nation had not yet learned the face attached to the fear. We begin there because that is where the true unease lives, in the gap between what people thought they were seeing and what was actually standing in front of them. A man with tidy hair, a measured voice, and the posture of someone who expected to be believed. A man who knew how to borrow the shape of decency while carrying something predatory and bottomless beneath it. And somewhere beyond the frame of those ordinary afternoons and dimly lit evenings, the story was already gathering force, moving toward discovery, toward pursuit, toward the moment when the scattered pieces would finally align. But before that reckoning, there was the long and terrible season of not knowing, and it is there, in that uncertainty, that the shadow of Ted Bundy first stretches across the story, thin at first, almost invisible, then widening until it darkens everything around it. Before the violence had a name that could be spoken on television with a mixture of disgust and fascination, there was a landscape that seemed almost built to encourage trust. The Pacific Northwest in the early 1970s carried a particular kind of beauty, lush and damp and open, the kind of place where mountains hovered at the edge of vision and water was never very far away. Even the air felt alive there, scented with cedar, wet earth, gasoline, coffee, and rain on pavement. Mornings often began beneath a gray ceiling, low clouds pressing over city streets and college campuses, only for the day to clear into pale sunlight that made the lake shine like sheets of glass. It was a region of ferries, bookstores, public parks, campus lawns, apartment balconies crowded with plants, and roads that slipped from busy neighborhoods into wooded quiet with surprising speed. Seattle and the towns around it were growing, changing, modernizing. On the surface, it was a hopeful place, full of movement and ambition, especially for the young. Universities pulled in students from different parts of the country. Law, psychology, medicine, politics, social work, journalism. All of it seemed to open into a future that was still being invented. There was a sense that life could be made from scratch there. That adulthood was not something inherited from older generations, but something chosen. For many young women, that feeling mattered. The early 1970s did not erase the old limits, but it loosened them just enough to create space. A woman could leave home, enroll in college, rent an apartment with friends, date who she pleased, drive alone, study late, work part-time. And imagine a life defined less by permission than by possibility. The setting of this story matters because that freedom was real, and because the person who had come to exploit it understood exactly how to move through a world shaped by openness. The campuses themselves were part of that atmosphere. They were not only places of study but little ecosystems of identity, experimentation, and routine. Students hurried to early classes with wet hair and notebooks pressed against their jackets. They drank bitter coffee in crowded cafeterias, pinned flyers to bulletin boards, debated politics, fell in and out of love, worried about grades, rent, and the future. A university town has its own sounds, like tires hissing on damp sidewalks, doors slamming in residence halls, snippets of music from open windows, footsteps echoing in stairwells, muffled laughter at night from across the quad. Safety, in such places, often feels implied rather than guaranteed. People move in groups until they do not. They borrow one another's sweaters, split groceries, share rides. Assume someone will notice if anything goes wrong. But daily life teaches a more dangerous lesson too. That because nothing terrible happened yesterday, nothing terrible will happen today. That assumption can settle over a community like a second weather system, invisible and reassuring, until it begins to crack. The broader culture of the United States during that era added its own layer to the story. The country had been changed by the previous decade. Institutions were being questioned. Public faith in authority had weakened in some places and hardened in others. There were generational tensions, ideological arguments, movements pushing against old hierarchies, and a growing media culture hungry for stories that could be packaged, televised, repeated, and consumed. Crime reporting was changing too. Certain cases no longer stayed local. They traveled. A murder in one state could become a national point of fixation if it carried enough mystery, enough contradiction, enough emotional charge. Yet policing and public understanding still lagged behind the complexity of crimes that crossed borders, especially crimes against women that began with disappearance rather than visible public violence. The institutional world in which this case unfolded was fragmented. Jurisdictions held their own files. Witness statements stayed in drawers or on desks. Patterns remained scattered longer than they should have. To understand the setting of this case is to understand not only the physical places involved, but the structure of the society in which those places were embedded. It was a world modern enough to produce educated, mobile, independent young adults, but still old-fashioned enough to underestimate the scale of threat that could hide inside ordinary male respectability. And that word, respectability, sits at the center of the background almost as much as geography does. Because the man at the center of this story did not emerge from the public imagination as a drifter, with madness stamped across his face. He could wear the costume of promise. In that period, appearance carried enormous social power. A clean haircut, measured speech, some level of education, the ability to speak with confidence to police or neighbors or strangers. These things did not prove innocence, but they often created an aura around it. People trusted signals. A man who seemed organized, ambitious, and personable could move through social spaces without activating immediate fear. If he asked for assistance, some people were inclined to grant it. If he offered an explanation, others were inclined to accept it. This was not naivete so much as the default structure of civic life. Most daily interactions depend on the assumption that other people are broadly what they seem. Remove that assumption and ordinary life becomes impossible. Exploit it, and ordinary life becomes dangerous. That was the emotional terrain in which the crimes took shape. The weather of the Northwest almost feels symbolic in retrospect. Rain softened edges and emptied streets earlier than expected. Twilight arrived with a kind of blur, swallowing detail. Cars hissed past on wet roads. Streetlights reflected in puddles and across windshields. A person could disappear into the ordinary dimness of a regional evening without anything appearing. Dramatic from a distance. Yet the region was not gloomy in the way memory sometimes turns it. There were bright summer days too, expansive and deceptively gentle. The kind of days that filled parks and lockshores with bodies, voices, towels, frisbees, coolers, radios playing from car windows. Those days carried their own vulnerability because they lowered defenses even further. Public leisure creates an illusion of communal safety. If enough people are nearby, danger feels less likely. But danger does not always need isolation at the start. Sometimes it only needs a small opening inside a crowded day. A brief moment of contact that seems too mundane to question. The setting, then, was not a single dark alley or remote cabin in the woods. It was the whole fabric of ordinary life: campuses, apartments, lakes, parking lots, sidewalks, beaches, bookstores, roads between towns. The places where young adults constructed their futures one ordinary choice at a time. And inside that fabric there were social rhythms that shaped vulnerability in subtler ways. Women were expected to be alert but not alarmed, independent but not cold, friendly but not reckless. They navigated a constant tension between freedom and caution, often without language strong enough to describe it. A man asking for help with books, with a boat, with a door, with something awkward and physical, could place a woman inside an old script almost instantly. Say yes, be kind, do not overreact, do not embarrass him, do not embarrass yourself. This was not a flaw in character. It was social conditioning woven into everyday interactions from childhood onward. To appreciate the setting and background of the case, one must see how the killer's methods intersected with those cultural expectations. He did not invent vulnerability, but he knew how to enter it. And he did so in a historical moment when the expanding mobility of young women had not yet been matched by the protective instincts of the institutions around them. Family life during that era forms another layer of the background. Many parents were raising children at a moment of cultural acceleration. Daughters who had grown up in one moral climate were stepping into a looser, more mobile one. The distance between home and campus might be physical, but it was also emotional. Parents wanted to believe in their children's independence because independence was supposed to be the reward for all those years of sacrifice and care. A daughter leaving for college was a sign of success, of adulthood arriving. Yet that very transition meant that many victims in cases like this inhabited two worlds at once. They were building separate lives, but their absence still radiated back through the family home with devastating force. A mother waiting by the phone, a father insisting on action, a sibling walking past a bedroom that still smelled faintly of shampoo and paper and the laundry detergent used at home. These were not side details. They were part of the emotional geography of the case. Disappearances do not occur in a vacuum. They tear holes through networks of expectation, memory, and love. Before the nation knew what pattern was forming, families and friends were already living inside that damage. Then there was the media environment, which increasingly amplified crime while often flattening the people inside it. Local anchors and newspapers could transform a missing person into a public concern, but they could also convert fear into spectacle. As certain cases accumulated attention, the line between urgent warning and morbid fascination began to thin. That would become crucial later, when the figure at the center of these crimes started to attract a kind of dark celebrity. But in the beginning, the media world was still learning the outline of the story. Reports emerged piecemeal. A disappearance here, a body found there, a witness remembering a detail that did not yet feel like a key. The public received fragments before it received a narrative. And fragments are dangerous. They invite rumor. They create false certainty in some places and paralyzing uncertainty in others. On campuses and in communities, people began to speak in low tones, offering one another scraps of information warnings that may or may not have been accurate, theories that spread because silence felt worse. Fear does not require complete knowledge. Often it grows fastest when knowledge is partial. The man later identified as the killer belonged to this setting in ways that made him hard to isolate from it. He was not outside the culture looking in. He was of it. He understood political ambition, the language of concern, the gestures of intellect, the value of appearing composed. He could step into rooms where people discussed public service and social problems. He could make himself seem like someone headed toward legitimacy, toward law, toward the professional classes. That background matters because it complicates the old comfort of imagining killers as visibly separate from the societies they wound. He did not live as a permanent outsider. He could move among institutions and social circles that conferred trust. He could borrow their credibility when needed. In retrospect, that capability seems chilling. At the time, it was precisely what made him less visible. He was not just passing through the setting. He was camouflaged by it. Meanwhile, the physical landscape offered concealment in its own blunt way. The Northwest was beautiful, but it was also spacious, irregular, and full of transitional zones where suburb, wilderness, and water seemed to overlap. Roads curved into tree cover. Quiet areas existed only minutes from busy ones. A person familiar with those routes could turn ordinary distance into strategic advantage. Nature in this region could feel welcoming by day and utterly indifferent by night. Forest edges swallowed sound. Water held secrets. Hills, ravines, and wooded clearings could make search efforts agonizingly difficult. The setting, therefore, was not merely scenic background but an accomplice of silence. Not by intention, but by geography. The land did what land does. It concealed, absorbed, and outlasted human panic. For investigators and families, that made uncertainty even more brutal. There were too many places to check. Too many ways for hope to stay alive just long enough to become another injury. And still, daily life went on. That is perhaps the most haunting part of the background. Buses ran. Lectures began on time. Cafes stayed open. Couples argued over small things. Students bought textbooks, took exams, and made weekend plans. Across the same region where fear was slowly germinating, people continued to participate in the ordinary because they had to. Life rarely pauses long enough to match the emotional scale of danger. Instead, it develops a split surface. Underneath, dread gathers. Above it, routines continue. This split is essential to the atmosphere of the case. It was not a world already coded as sinister. It was a normal world, functioning, busy, even beautiful. And that normality is what made the coming violence feel so invasive. A predatory intelligence learned to move through environments full of trust, habit, and distraction. He used the manners of decent society against the people most conditioned to respond to them. He operated in a region where weather could blur edges, where public spaces created false reassurance, where institutions were not yet equipped to connect dispersed warning signs quickly enough, and where young women were claiming new forms of independence inside a culture that still underestimated the threats aimed at them. That is the true setting of this story. Not just Seattle, not just a campus, not just the decade. It is the intersection of beauty and blind spots, freedom and fragility, progress and unexamined assumptions. It is a time and place where people still believed they could read danger on sight, and where that belief was about to be tested in the most devastating way. By the time the pattern became undeniable, the background had already done its work. It had shaped behavior, delayed recognition, and supplied the killer with cover he did not need to invent for himself. He only had to recognize it. He only had to step into the flow of ordinary life and let the culture do part of the masking. That is what makes the opening of this case so chilling. The landscape was not hostile. The era was not uniformly dark. The world these victims inhabited was vibrant, full of motion, intelligence, affection, and possibility. Their lives were not defined by what would happen to them. They belong to a generation moving toward the future with all the uncertainty and excitement that implies. And into that world, into those rainy campuses and summer parks and apartment kitchens and family phone calls, came a man who understood how to make himself seem like part of the scenery until it was too late. That is the setting. That is the background. A beautiful region, a changing country, a culture that mistook polish for safety, and a long, slow approach of violence that at first looked almost exactly like everyday life. The victims in this story did not enter the world as names attached to case files, newspaper columns, or future documentaries. They entered it the way most people do, in kitchens warmed by morning light, in family photographs where someone is always half blinking, in school hallways, at birthday parties, on front porches, in the ordinary sequence of growing up that feels unremarkable while it is happening and sacred only after something terrible interrupts it. Before they became part of a case that would horrify the country, they were daughters, sisters, students, friends, roommates, young women building lives that were still in motion. Some were serious and disciplined, the kind of people who kept planners, remembered deadlines, and carried themselves with a quiet sense of direction. Others were more spontaneous, warm, social, quick to laugh. The kind of presence that changes the tone of a room just by entering it. Some were still figuring out what they wanted their futures to look like. Trying on versions of adulthood the way other people try on clothes, imagining careers, relationships, cities, adventures. Some had already chosen a path and were walking toward it with focus. What links them now, in hindsight, is not who they were in life but what was done to them. And that is the first injustice any telling of this case must resist. Because the true story of the victims is not the story of how they disappeared. It is the story of the lives that were underway before that moment ever arrived. In the Pacific Northwest and beyond, the women targeted by Bundy were often at the age when life feels both fragile and limitless. College years and early adulthood create a strange emotional weather. The past is still close enough to touch, family routines, old bedrooms, the voices of parents calling from another room. But the future has begun to open outward in ways both thrilling and uncertain. A young woman might be balancing classes with a part-time job, writing letters home, sharing an apartment with friends, learning what it means to make choices that belong entirely to her. She might be in love, or recovering from heartbreak, or too busy to think much about either. She might be changing her major, saving for a trip, worrying about tuition, planning a weekend by the water, thinking about exams, thinking about nothing at all beyond dinner and sleep. That ordinariness matters. It is not filler around the edges of tragedy. It is the substance of what was stolen. One victim may have been the kind of daughter whose parents still measured time partly through her phone calls. Another may have been the sister who remembered birthdays, who offered advice, who borrowed sweaters and returned them late. Another may have been the friend people leaned on because she seemed calm even when everything around her felt chaotic. Another may have been the bright center of a social circle, always suggesting the next outing, always turning a quiet afternoon into a memory. And another may have carried a private, inward life, a seriousness people did not fully appreciate until they were forced to remember her through absence. Victims in cases like this often get flattened into a single category: young women, students, missing persons, but the truth is more textured. Every one of them had a way of walking into a room, a way of pushing hair behind an ear, a tone of voice on the phone, a particular impatience, a particular kindness. Habits so small they might have seemed invisible before loss made them unforgettable. A roommate remembers the mug left in the sink. A mother remembers the exact coat her daughter liked to wear when it rained. A sibling remembers a slammed door after some stupid argument that no one imagined would become precious in memory. A boyfriend remembers a plan postponed. A classmate remembers a seat that stays empty one day too long. That is how victimhood begins to register in real life. Not as a headline, but as disruption in the intimate grammar of other people's days. The women Bundy targeted were often described as bright, capable, attractive, socially visible. That pattern has been discussed for decades, sometimes in ways that feel uncomfortably close to reducing them to type. But what it really suggests is that these were women deeply alive inside the world around them. They were not marginal to their own stories. They were central, active, moving through campuses, neighborhoods, friendships, ambitions. They had plans. They were becoming. That is why their disappearances struck with such force. When a person whose life is visibly in motion suddenly vanishes, the mind resists it. Everyone around her instinctively searches for a harmless explanation because the alternative is too large, too violent, too absurd to admit at once. A friend says, maybe she got delayed. A parent says maybe she is staying somewhere else for the night. Someone checks with classmates, then hospitals, then police. Every hour that passes changes the emotional temperature. At first there is inconvenience, confusion, irritation even. Then worry. Then something colder. And once that cold enters, it does not fully leave. To tell the victim's story honestly is also to tell the story of the people who loved them. In one home there may have been a mother standing by the kitchen phone, lifting the receiver again and again to make sure the line works, as though silence might be a technical failure instead of a fact. In another there may have been a father driving familiar routes with no plan except movement, checking roads, parking lots, places he has no reason to believe will matter and yet cannot ignore. In another there may have been roommates sitting together late into the night, going back over the day in fragments. What time did she leave? What was she wearing? Did she mention meeting anyone? Did anything seem wrong? While outside the window the campus continues in its usual rhythm. Laughter from somewhere across the street, a door shutting, rain beginning again. Grief in its earliest stage is not pure sadness. It is a frantic form of accounting. Everyone becomes an investigator of memory. Everyone looks for the missed signal. The victims' families and friends were forced into that brutal work long before the broader public understood what pattern was taking shape. Some of the women who vanished had traits that made them especially memorable in the eyes of those around them. A certain confidence, a particular style, a discipline about studies or future goals, a warmth that held circles of friends together. Others may have moved more quietly through the world, but quiet lives are not lesser lives. The tragedy in a case like this is cumulative precisely because each victim was distinct. One may have loved the orderliness of books and planned routines. Another the spontaneity of music and long conversations. Another the peace of being outdoors. Another the intellectual energy of classrooms and debates. One may have been close to her family in the daily sense, frequent calls, regular visits, little updates shared almost automatically. Another may have been in the looser stage of adulthood, affectionate but preoccupied, assuming there would always be time later to explain herself better, to visit more often, to say the things families always think can wait. Then suddenly time is gone, and what remains are the unfinished edges of ordinary love. That unfinished quality is part of what makes the victim's story so painful. No life ends at a narratively convenient point. There is always laundry not folded, a letter unanswered, a library book not returned, a call not made, a plan for next week that still exists in someone else's notebook. The women at the center of this case were living in that unfinished state. Their futures had not yet narrowed into fixed identities. They were still exploring what they could become. Some may have imagined professional lives in law, psychology, medicine, education, or the arts. Some may have wanted families of their own. Some may have wanted travel, cities, independence, movement. Some probably had no clear map at all. Only the normal confidence of youth that time was abundant and the self could be discovered gradually. Violence does not only destroy what a person is. It erases all the versions of that person that might have existed. That is why a victim story cannot stop at biography. It must include possibility. It must include the futures that were beginning to take shape in invisible ways. In many true crime narratives, victims are described through the words others used about them after their deaths: beautiful, kind, smart, beloved. Those words are sincere, but they can become generic if not grounded. What gives them weight are the lived details beneath them. Kind might mean the woman who stayed after class to help someone else study. Smart might mean the one who carried too many books, who underlined passages, who argued intensely and then laughed at herself. Beloved might mean the friend who knew how to make lonely people feel included. Beautiful might mean not an abstract standard, but the vividness someone brought into a room, the openness in her face when she trusted the world. That last detail is almost unbearable in retrospect. Trust becomes painful when viewed through the lens of betrayal. Yet we should be careful not to rewrite these women as naive simply because someone preyed on decency. Trust was not their flaw. It was part of being human in a functioning society. The moral failure belongs entirely to the person who weaponized it. The victim story is also, inevitably, a story about atmosphere before disappearance. A summer day that felt ordinary. A walk across campus. A stop at a store. A plan to meet someone later. A drive toward a familiar place. Every case has such a threshold, the last portion of life still untouched by public tragedy. It is often impossible to reconstruct emotionally because everyone who survives sees it backward. But imagining that threshold matters. Somewhere a woman checked her reflection quickly in a mirror, picked up keys, maybe thought about what to do that evening, maybe felt mildly tired, mildly hurried, mildly distracted. Nothing in that moment would have signaled destiny. That is the cruelty. Catastrophe rarely feels like catastrophe while a victim is still inside ordinary time. It feels like weather, errands, conversations, decisions measured in minutes. The women targeted by Bundy were not moving toward legend or cautionary symbolism. They were moving through a day. And in that day were all the marks of personhood that get erased when a case becomes famous. Preferences, moods, private jokes, anxieties, ambitions, fatigue. Hopes so ordinary no one writes them down. Their families preserved what they could. A photograph, a habit, a story told at gatherings years later with the careful smile people use when memory is both comfort and wound. In the decades after the crimes, public attention often drifted back toward the killer, his face, his lies, his psychology, his notoriety. But for the families, the gravity remained elsewhere. It remained in the daughter, who should have grown older, the sister who should have come home for holidays, the friend who should have appeared in reunion photographs, the woman who should have had the chance to outgrow who she was at 20, 21, 22 and discover who she might be at 40, 50, 60. That is what the victim story becomes over time, not only the record of who they were, but the shape of the life arc that never got to complete itself. Even those who did not know the victims personally could feel something intimate in these cases. Because the women embodied a familiar stage of life. They represented the bright instability of youth, the sense of being on the verge of everything. To watch that extinguished is to confront a particularly cruel form of theft. It does not merely end a life that was already fully formed in public memory. It interrupts becoming. It leaves everyone else to carry an unfinished sentence. So, if this part of the story lingers, it should linger here, not on the killer's methods, not on the mythology that later surrounded him, but on the human scale of those he targeted. On the student hurrying to class. On the daughter whose mother still expected to hear from her. On the roommate waiting for a key in the door. On the friend who saved a seat. On the family table, where one chair became too painful to look at directly. On the quiet facts of character that endure longer than headlines. Intelligence, humor, discipline, shyness, loyalty, warmth, restlessness, aspiration. On the tiny, domestic details that prove a person was once vividly present in the world. Their story is not a prelude to his. It is the center that his violence tried to erase. And the most respectful way to tell it is to hold that center in place. To remember that before the investigation, before the courtroom, before the name Ted Bundy hardened into national infamy, there were women living complicated. promising unfinished lives, and there were people who loved them in all the ordinary, daily ways that make loss unbearable. That is the victim's story, not a single portrait, but many. Not one silence, but a series of silences spreading through homes, campuses, and circles of friendship. Not a legend, but a wound made up of individual lives, each one distinct, each one irreplaceable, each one deserving to be remembered first as a person who is here, who mattered, who was loved, and who should have had the chance to remain the author of her own future. By the time violence finally enters a story, in a way no one can explain away, it rarely feels dramatic at first. It feels inconvenient, slightly strange, easy to rationalize. The incident, in a case like this, does not begin with sirens or with a witness pointing into darkness. It begins with timing, with a person being in one place at one moment and then not being in the next, with a casual plan that should have led to a safe return, with a day that looked like every other day until some small, ordinary sequence was interrupted so cleanly that, at first, nobody even recognizes the interruption for what it is. That is the nature of predatory violence when it is carried out by someone who understands social behavior as well as physical control. The first weapon is often not force. It is plausibility. It is the ability to make a moment appear harmless long enough for danger to close its hand. Imagine the day in its unbroken form before the break occurs. Morning moving into afternoon. People drifting across a campus or through a public park, carrying towels, books, bags, groceries, notebooks, all the portable evidence of ordinary life. There is weather, maybe warmth, maybe damp air lifting off water, maybe the low marine brightness of the Northwest that makes everything look soft at the edges. There are conversations cut short with casual promises to talk later. Someone says she will not be long. Someone else says see you tonight. There is no theater in any of it. No music, no signal, no reason to imagine that one of these partings will become permanent. The woman at the center of such a moment is not thinking in symbolic terms. She is not walking into an incident. She is walking through a day. That distinction matters because true horror does not descend onto people who feel narratively prepared. It enters through the side door of routine. And the man waiting for that opening understands this perfectly. He does not need to terrify a crowd. He needs to isolate a single decision, a brief pause, a flicker of sympathy, a social reflex, a moment in which the person he has selected sees not a threat but a request. Perhaps he appears awkward. Perhaps he creates the impression of inconvenience, of needing an extra pair of hands. Perhaps there is something physically disarming about him. Some detail arranged to soften caution and trigger helpfulness. He knows how to stand just inside the boundaries of ordinary trust. He knows how to seem like the kind of man people would later describe as normal, polite, maybe slightly forgettable. That is the true speed of the incident. From the outside, it may have taken only minutes. From the inside, it probably unfolded in stages too quick and confusing to resist in the way later observers always imagine resistance should happen. First, an interaction that appears minor. Then a shift in tone, barely perceptible at first. Then movement away from the safety of the public eye. Then, abruptly, the world narrows. Space changes. Breath changes. The logic of the day collapses. What had been ordinary becomes incomprehensible. The incident is not just the attack itself. It is the irreversible crossing from one reality into another. One moment, a young woman is still inside the known structure of her life, appointments, friends, weather, errands, plans. The next, she has been pulled into the private intention of someone who has already imagined this moment before she ever arrived in it. That is one of the most frightening truths at the center of this case. For the victims, the incident was a sudden rupture. For the killer, it was preparation meeting opportunity. He had rehearsed the approach in his mind long before any individual woman crossed his path. He understood what kind of body language lowered defenses, what kind of requests sounded harmless, how to use the expectations of public courtesy like tools. He understood that a crowded setting is not always an obstacle if the opening move looks ordinary. Enough. People do not intervene in normality. They intervene in scenes that visibly announce themselves as wrong. So he works in that thin space before wrongness becomes legible. If there are witnesses, they remember the details that now seem sinister only in retrospect. A man asking for help, a cast, a sling, a careful voice, a car nearby. The strangeness, if any, feels too slight at the time to justify alarm. Later, those same details become unbearable because they reveal how close danger stood to everyone, without fully declaring itself. The incident, then, is partly an act of disappearance performed in plain sight. Someone is last seen speaking to a man. Someone is last seen walking toward a parking lot. Someone is last seen near a vehicle. The visual record is minimal, almost insultingly ordinary. That ordinariness is what allows memory to fail in the moment and then sharpen too late. People remember after the fact, not before. They retrieve fragments under pressure. A face, an object, a color, a direction of movement. But memory is a cruel instrument in the immediate aftermath because it offers just enough to inflame. Urgency without enough to stop what has already happened. And once the victim is no longer visible, the incident expands beyond the moment of contact into a different kind of violence. The violence of uncertainty. Friends wait. Family waits. Hours pass. The clock becomes an enemy. The longer nothing happens, the more imagination begins filling the silence with possibilities. At first, the benign explanations still survive. She got delayed. She lost track of time. Her car would not start. She stayed elsewhere. But these explanations begin to sound brittle as night gathers and no word arrives. The emotional tempo shifts. The missing person becomes the center of every conversation. People start checking with one another, retracing steps, calling places, asking the same questions again and again because repetition is a way of fighting powerlessness. What was she wearing? Who saw her last? Did she mention meeting anyone? Did anything seem wrong? It is only afterward that the most devastating answer emerges. Nothing seemed wrong. Because what happened was designed not to seem wrong until the last possible second. The man at the center of the incident exploited that delay in recognition with terrifying efficiency. He did not need prolonged chaos at the point of contact. He needed control, privacy, and momentum. Once he had drawn a victim out of the visible current of public life, the rest depended on speed and force hidden from witnesses. That hidden portion of the incident is where most people's imaginations race, and where responsible telling must be careful. The violence was real, intimate, and devastating, but its moral weight does not depend on reproducing every physical detail. What matters is the transformation. A human being with a future was overpowered by someone who saw her not as a person, but as an object, inside a private fantasy of domination. The incident is therefore psychological as much as physical. It is the moment when one person's ordinary trust collides with another person's cultivated predation. It is the point where the social world fails to protect the individual inside it. It is where all the assumptions that make daytime life bearable, that strangers can be read, that public spaces offer some measure of safety, that politeness is not fatal, suddenly collapse. For the people left behind, the incident is first visible only through absence. A room stays empty. A phone does not ring. A meal goes cold. Someone checks a watch too many times. Someone drives somewhere at midnight with no clear plan except hope. The search begins long before it becomes organized. It begins in the body, in the refusal to sit still, in the instinct to go looking. Parents, friends, partners, siblings become temporary detectives before the police have even caught up to the urgency. They walk routes, knock on doors, ask around, replay the last conversation. Every passing hour stiffens fear into something harder. And still the incident itself remains incomplete in their understanding. They know only the before and the after. The crucial middle is hidden. That hidden middle is what gives cases like this their long, haunting quality. The absence of direct witness, the gap in sequence. The sense that the decisive moment occurred just outside the range of ordinary attention. All of it creates a wound that facts alone cannot fully close. In the broader pattern of this case, each incident carried echoes of the others, though the people experiencing them in real time could not yet see the full design. One woman vanishes, then another, and the similarities begin as murmurs, too faint to command certainty. Youth, visibility, a public setting, a normal day abruptly interrupted, a last sighting that sounds almost mundane. The incidents accumulate before they cohere. This is important because serial violence is often understood backward, as though a pattern must have been obvious from the beginning. It rarely is. In real time, each incident feels singular, enclosed within its own circle of grief and confusion. Only later does the larger architecture appear. Only later do people realize that the same hand may have moved beneath several separate silences. But at the moment of each individual incident, there is no architecture, only a torn opening in ordinary life. If one imagines the killer's perspective, what emerges is not madness in the cinematic sense, but a cold attentiveness to sequence. He watches, he selects, he approaches, he calculates the behavior of others. He relies on the fact that most people are absorbed in their own errands, conversations, and private thoughts. He depends on how swiftly a crowd can become irrelevant once one person is separated from it by only a few steps and a believable pretext. That is why the incident remains so chilling even when described without sensationalism. It demonstrates how fragile public safety can be when someone is willing to study the ordinary rules that govern human interaction and then invert them. Helpfulness becomes exposure. Courtesy becomes access. A harmless request becomes the first move in an assault. And because the request itself is so minor, so socially legible, no alarm is raised until alarm is useless. Then comes the secondary incident, the one that unfolds in kitchens, living rooms, police stations, dormitories, and search parties. The moment when private dread becomes public concern. Flyers are made. Descriptions are repeated. Friends begin speaking to officers. Witnesses surface with hesitant recollections. Did anyone see a man nearby? Did anyone notice a vehicle? Did anyone hear a name? The victim, who only hours earlier belonged fully to the flow of her own life, is suddenly transformed in the public record into a subject of inquiry. That transformation is violent in its own way. A person becomes a set of identifiers. Height, clothing, time last seen. But beneath that procedural language, fear is still deeply human. Families imagine the worst while begging themselves not to. Police try to organize uncertainty into sequence. News begins to spread. People who never met the missing woman start adjusting their own behavior in response. Doors are locked earlier. Friends stop walking alone. Rides are offered. Warnings are shared with a new edge of seriousness. The incident ripples outward beyond the victim almost immediately, changing the behavior of people who understand, perhaps before investigators do, that something predatory has entered the landscape. Yet the center of it remains intensely personal. Somewhere there is a parent staring at the front door. Somewhere there is a roommate unable to sleep because the sound of footsteps in the hall keeps producing a surge of hope that collapses every time. Somewhere there is a detective leaning over a desk late at night, trying to make disconnected details speak. And somewhere beyond all of them, the man responsible is moving through his own next steps with the eerie composure of someone who believes he has once again remained just ahead of consequence. That is what makes Part 4, the incident, feel so unbearable. It is not simply that an attack occurred. It is that the attack was folded into the shape of normal life so neatly that normal life itself became suspect afterward. A parking lot was no longer just a parking lot. A request for help was no longer just a request. A handsome face, a calm tone, a minor injury, a social smile. None of these could remain innocent in the same way once they had been used as camouflage for violence. The incident altered not only one victim's fate, but the emotional logic of the community around her. Fear gained a face it could not yet identify, and a method it could only dimly understand. That is why these moments endure in memory with such cold force. They reveal that catastrophe does not always arrive as spectacle. Sometimes it arrives dressed as ordinary inconvenience, standing in the daylight, asking for help in a voice soft enough to make refusal feel unreasonable. And by the time the true nature of the encounter becomes visible, the day has already split open. The victim has already been pulled beyond the reach of familiar life. And everyone left behind has already entered the long, terrible afterlife of waiting, searching, and realizing that the smallest moment can become the hinge on which an entire world turns into nightmare. By the time a crime scene is discovered, the violence itself is already in the past. But the past does not feel finished. It lingers in the air in the position of objects, in the silence surrounding a place that has suddenly become charged with meaning. What had once been ordinary ground, a roadside pullout, a patch of woods, a slope above a riverbank, an isolated clearing beyond the edge of regular foot traffic, is transformed in an instant into a threshold between two worlds. One is the world that existed before the discovery, where families still lived in the unstable territory between fear and hope. The other is the world after, where absence hardens into something far more terrible because the landscape itself has begun to answer back. Part 5 of this story belongs to that moment of answer. It belongs to the discovery, to the first people who arrive without yet knowing exactly what they are seeing, to the investigators forced to read damage from fragments, and to the awful shift in everyone's understanding when a missing person case becomes undeniably a homicide investigation. It is one of the cruelest stages in any true crime story because it takes uncertainty, which at least allows room for imagination and replaces it with physical fact. But physical fact does not arrive neatly. It emerges piece by piece, and every piece carries its own emotional weight. The places where these discoveries occurred were often quiet in the most indifferent way. Nature did not announce what had happened there. Trees moved in the wind. Water continued its slow, patient motion. Insects hummed in the undergrowth. Rain darkened the soil. Sunlight slipped through branches and touched the ground as if nothing in that place had changed. That indifference is part of what makes discovery so haunting. Human violence can be unspeakably intimate, but the world around it remains impersonal. A passerby, a hiker, a worker, a hunter, someone cutting through an area they have crossed before, without incident, notices something out of place. It may not even register at first as human evidence. A color where no color should be. A shape interrupting the natural line of the earth. A smell that does not belong to fresh air and wet leaves. A stillness that feels wrong, though stillness itself is common in remote places. Then comes the second look. The one people later remember with disturbing clarity because it divides their life into before and after. Before, they were only walking. After, they had seen something they would never entirely forget. The first people on a discovery scene are rarely prepared for the emotional violence of recognition. They know, often within seconds, that they have crossed into something irreversible. If they call authorities, their voice may already have changed by the time the words come out. There is often a strange practical quality to those first minutes. Directions must be given. Landmarks described. Access routes explained. Yet, underneath that practical layer, shock is already setting in. In cases like this, the discovery site does not simply reveal a victim. It reveals the killer's hidden geography, the private map of where he believed he could take, leave, and conceal another human being. That is why such scenes matter so much to investigators. They are not only tragic endpoints. They are messages, however incomplete, about behavior, confidence, movement, and method. When law enforcement arrives, the emotional atmosphere changes again. Discovery gives way to procedure. Vehicles roll in. Radios crackle. Perimeters are set. People are moved back. Boots press into mud, gravel, grass. The scene becomes a place of work, but the work is never free from dread. Every investigator who has seen enough death knows that the first minutes on scene are a battle against contamination, haste, and assumption. What lies in front of them may be partial, degraded by weather, time, or scavengers, altered by the environment in ways that make certainty difficult. Yet they must begin building certainty anyway. They crouch, observe, mark, photograph, measure. They notice the lay of the land, the access points, the signs of disturbance. The absence or presence of clothing, jewelry, fibers, tire impressions, footprints, broken branches, drag marks, any suggestion that the body was placed rather than left where death occurred. In a case like Bundy's, these early crime scenes often spoke in whispers rather than declarations. They did not offer a clean narrative. They offered fragments of a struggle between concealment and exposure. The killer had chosen places where isolation did some of the work for him. But no concealment is perfect forever. Weather shifts, animals move, human eyes eventually land where he hoped they would not. And once that happens, what he tried to hide enters the realm of evidence. The discovery of remains is devastating for families in a way that outsiders sometimes misunderstand. People imagine that certainty, even terrible certainty, must bring relief. In one narrow sense, it does. The mind no longer has to keep inventing rescue scenarios, miraculous returns, amnesia plots borrowed from desperate imagination. But what replaces those fantasies is not peace. It is a different, heavier form of grief. Because now the person who was missing is also physically absent in a more final way. The body, or what remains of it, must be identified. The site must be processed. Personal effects, if found, become sacred and unbearable all at once. A ring, a shoe, a scrap of fabric, a necklace clasp, a bone emerging from the earth. These are no longer ordinary objects. They are the last surviving witnesses. That is what the crime scene becomes in a case like this, a silent field of witnesses. None of them complete, all of them demanding interpretation. For investigators, the initial clues are often maddeningly small. A trace fiber caught on brush. The pattern of decomposition relative to weather exposure. The way remains are positioned. The possibility that more than one victim may have passed through the same hidden zone. In a serial case, discovery scenes begin to talk to one another across distance and time. Similarities surface slowly. Site selection, body disposal methods, repeated habits. The killer's confidence grows visible not because he leaves a signature in the theatrical sense, but because patterns of choice begin to emerge. He favors certain kinds of terrain. He returns to environments he understands. He trusts remoteness, trusts the silence of wooded land, trusts that time and decay will blur what he has done. The investigators on these scenes are not merely documenting death. They are learning the shape of an unseen mind by studying where it leaves human beings behind. The sensory reality of discovery is something every homicide investigator carries in some private corner of memory. The smell of wet vegetation mixed with decomposition. The metallic taste of adrenaline in the mouth. The low voices because people almost always lower their voices around death, even outdoors. The clicking of cameras. The rustle of evidence bags. The sudden silence when someone notices something especially important and everyone else instinctively stills. There is a ritual quality to it, though no one would call it that on the record. Scenes like these are entered with care because a person is present there, even if the living world now encounters her only through remains. Respect matters. It matters in how the scene is approached, how the body is handled, how language is used among professionals, how every fragment is accounted for. In a case where the killer himself denied dignity, the investigative response becomes, at its best, an attempt to restore some measure of it. Yet respect alone cannot solve the case. Evidence must. so the scene is read with ruthless attention. If remains are found in an area not easily reached by accident, that suggests transport and intention. If articles of clothing are separated from the body, that raises questions about the sequence of events. If skeletal remains are scattered, investigators must distinguish what happened at the time of death from what happened afterward through natural processes. Every answer is provisional at first. Forensic work in that era did not have the speed or sophistication people sometimes imagine today. Investigators relied heavily on physical observation, pathology, witness accounts, dental comparison, timelines, and patient accumulation rather than instant technological revelation. That made the crime scene both more central and more frustrating. It could not speak plainly, and there was no machine capable of forcing it to. The scene had to be interpreted by people, which meant by judgment, experience, caution, and sometimes error. One of the most unsettling aspects of these discovery sites is how they redraw the map of fear. Before a body is found, the danger exists mostly in abstraction: a missing woman, a suspicious encounter, a rumor of a man asking for help near a campus or a lake. After a body is found, the danger acquires terrain. People learn that a certain road, hillside, wooded edge, or riverbank has entered the case. Once a place is named in connection with death, it changes permanently in the imagination of a community. Parents hear that name and think of daughters. Students hear it and imagine themselves alone at dusk. Detectives look at maps differently. Search teams return to similar areas because discovery creates the terrible possibility of more discoveries. That is another burden of the initial scene in a serial case. It does not close the search. It expands it. One set of remains can imply another. One hidden dumping ground can suggest a system. One clue can force the realization that the killer did not act once in panic, but repeatedly with planning. When the first clues begin to connect, the investigation deepens in both urgency and darkness. Witness accounts that once seemed isolated gain new relevance. A man seen with his arm in a sling near a public area, a brown or tan vehicle, a polite request for help, a sudden disappearance from a busy place. These details now orbit a material center. The crime scene does not identify the killer outright, but it validates the fear that a predator is working with method. It also gives investigators something they lacked before: the ability to classify what they're dealing with. This is no longer only a missing person's concern. It is murder. It is deliberate. It is organized enough to leave bodies in locations chosen for concealment. That change in classification affects everything: how departments allocate resources, how neighboring agencies communicate, how media reports the danger, how communities react, how witnesses understand what they may have seen. The discovery also strips away denial. For a parent, that stripping away can feel almost physically violent. Until remains are identified, some small chamber of hope may stay alive against reason. Afterward, even if formal identification takes time, the emotional landscape has already altered. Families are pulled into a new ritual of dread: medical examiner calls, official notifications, requests for dental records, questions no parent should ever have to answer. Friends gather and speak in stunned fragments. Some cry immediately. Others become eerily practical, as if making tea, answering phones, or arranging rides can hold back the larger truth. In these moments, the crime scene extends far beyond the patch of ground where evidence was collected. It enters homes. It enters sleep. It enters memory. Everyone connected to the victim begins imagining the place where she was found, whether they want to or not. That imagined place becomes inseparable from grief. Even when the public knows only broad facts, the loved ones often understand more. Enough to suffer from details they did not ask for and will never entirely escape. For investigators, the initial clues rarely feel dramatic in the cinematic sense. They feel incomplete. One trace suggests contact. Another suggests transport. Another suggests time elapsed. Pathologists examine injury patterns, estimate cause and manner of death where possible, and distinguish pre-mortem trauma from post-mortem environmental damage. Searchers grid nearby areas. Detectives compare maps. They ask who knew these roads, who could move through such terrain confidently, who possessed the composure to transport and leave victims without immediate detection. In a case like this, the killer's psychological profile begins not in an interview room, but on the ground. The choice of disposal sites suggests familiarity, daring, and emotional distance from the suffering inflicted. The repeated use of isolation suggests confidence and control. The absence of panic at the scene suggests someone who does not experience these crimes as accidents, but as expressions of something rehearsed and desired. That is the chilling power of the discovery. It reveals not only that a murder occurred, but that the murder belongs to a pattern of mind. By the end of the stage, the investigation has crossed a threshold. The missing women are no longer held only in photographs on bulletin boards or in the worried voices of roommates and families. They have been found, or part of them has, and found in circumstances that force the world to understand what kind of case this is becoming. The wooded hillside, the remote clearing, the roadside embankment, all of it now belongs to the record. Technicians pack their evidence. Detectives leave with notebooks heavier than before. The coroner's vehicle pulls away. The site itself falls quiet again, but it is no longer empty. It has entered the narrative permanently. That is what Part 5 means in a story like this. It is the moment the earth gives something back, not enough to heal, not enough to explain everything, but enough to make ignorance impossible. The discovery turns fear into fact, grief into a sharper instrument, and suspicion into a hunt for pattern. It confronts investigators with the first solid contours of an unseen predator and confronts families with the unbearable truth that the person they loved is not coming home. From here, the case can only move deeper into darkness before it moves toward justice. The crime scene has spoken, quietly, incompletely, but with terrible authority. And everyone who hears it knows that the story is changed forever. By the time investigators reached the stage where names, vehicles, timelines, and witness statements began to gather into something resembling a pattern, the case had already become larger than any one office, any one department, any one detective's instinct. That was part of the frustration. The dead were accumulating inside separate files while the man responsible kept moving through the world with the outward ease of someone who understood just how fragmented the system around him really was. Part 6 belongs to that bleak middle stretch of the story, the phase every major investigation dreads. When there is enough evidence to know that the threat is real, organized, and ongoing, but not enough to stop it. This is the chapter of suspects, false starts, misread signals, and doors that seemed promising until they opened onto nothing. It is the chapter where the investigation begins to move faster, but certainty remains just out of reach. In a case like this, that gap between momentum and resolution becomes its own kind of torment. Detectives feel it. Families feel it. Entire communities feel it. There is activity everywhere and closure nowhere. The investigation during this stage would have had a particular kind of rhythm. Long hours punctuated by bursts of urgency. Then long stretches again, in which nothing seemed to land. Phones rang. Reports multiplied. Detectives compared notes across desks, across counties, across state lines that did not yet communicate as fluidly as public fear required. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Sketches were discussed, criticized, revised in memory rather than on paper. A man with an injured arm had been seen in one place. A man with a cast had been seen in another. A brown or tan vehicle surfaced in recollections often enough to become haunting. And then there was the name, Ted Plain, almost insultingly plain, surfacing in witness memory like something too small to matter and yet too specific to ignore. The simplicity of it made the frustration worse. Detectives were not hunting a figure draped in obvious eccentricity. They were hunting a person who might have looked exactly like the sort of man no one would stop. Twice in the daylight. That shaped the whole investigation. Serial violence invites the fantasy that the offender must look deranged, feral, visibly wrong. But organized predators often defeat that fantasy by understanding performance better than everyone else in the room. The suspect in this case could pass. He could appear educated, self-possessed, even helpful. He could occupy social settings where ambition and charm did some of the camouflage for him. That meant the suspect pool was not limited to drifters, men already known for overt instability, or local eccentrics with reputations that preceded them. It widened alarmingly. Any man with the right vehicle, the right age range, the right presence, the right ability to move between public normalcy and private violence could fit. And when a suspect pool becomes too broad, every lead threatens to dissolve under its own weight. Detectives were forced into the patient, grinding labor that defines real investigations far more than dramatic confrontations ever do. They pulled records. They checked alibis. They spoke to employers, neighbors, classmates, former partners, acquaintances who could offer only impressions instead of evidence. One man seemed odd but had no opportunity. Another had opportunity but no corroborating behavior. A third looked right on paper and wrong in person. A fourth inspired certainty in someone's gut, but nothing that could survive scrutiny. This is where dead ends begin to shape the psychology of an investigation. Every lead asks for belief. Every failed lead punishes it. Detectives become cautious, then stubborn, then sometimes superstitious in private. Not because they cease to think clearly, but because repetition wears down clean reasoning. A man can only hear so many almost right stories before he begins to fear that the real answer may pass by dressed as another almost. Meanwhile, public fear changes the environment around the case. Women begin altering their routines. Friends refuse to let one another walk alone. Men who match parts of the description are noticed more often, sometimes confronted in rumor, if not in person. The line between vigilance and panic begins to thin. And panic is rarely helpful to an investigation. It generates noise. Every suspicious car becomes the car. Every charming stranger becomes potentially lethal. Every memory becomes more dramatic in hindsight. Detectives are grateful for tips and exhausted by them at the same time. They know the breakthrough may be hiding inside the flood, but the flood itself can bury it. Families watching this phase from the outside experience a different torment. From their perspective, police are always either doing too little or too much of the wrong thing. And both impressions can be true at different moments. A mother hearing that there are suspects may briefly feel hope, only to learn days later that nothing has come of it. A father may become consumed by one theory and furious when authorities seem unwilling to chase it harder. Friends may recall details they dismissed earlier and wonder whether they have failed the victim by remembering too late. This is the stage at which guilt begins to migrate outward from the offender to everyone who survived him. People ask themselves impossible questions. Why did I not insist she call me? Why did I not notice that man? Why did I not speak up sooner? Why did I trust the world to remain ordinary for one more day? Investigations create that emotional weather around them, especially when the offender remains free. The longer the dead end lasts, the more everyone connected to the case begins to feel as if they're living in a world where consequences have come loose from action, where violence can be committed and then simply folded back into the daily routine of someone who knows how to smile and answer questions. There is also a deeper investigative problem in cases like this. The suspect himself may not feel peripheral to normal society. He may feel central to it. That sense of belonging can make him bold. A predator who sees himself as smarter than police, more adaptive than witnesses, more convincing than the people around him, does not necessarily act like a man cornered. He may present himself with calm, volunteer explanations before being asked, insert himself into conversations, shape impressions with deliberate care. Such a person is difficult to lock down because he understands that investigation is not only about evidence. It is also about narrative. Who seems plausible? Who seems harmless? Who speaks clearly? Who knows when to laugh, when to frown, when to feign concern? During this dead-end phase, that social intelligence may matter almost as much as forensic absence. If the evidence trail is incomplete and the suspect is skilled at performance, detectives are left battling not only what they do not know, but what he wants other people to believe. Witness accounts only partly solve that problem. Some remembered a man with a cast. Others recalled a sling. Some remembered the request for help. Others the vehicle. Some had a general sense of attractiveness or polish that made the encounter memorable after the fact. Yet witness memory is fragile under pressure. The same detail that feels decisive in one interview softens in the next. Distances shrink or expand. Colors shift. Timelines blur. Investigators know this, but they cannot dismiss memory simply because it is imperfect. They must work with what human beings actually remember, not what television has taught the public they ought to remember. So they build composites out of uncertainty, layering recollections until a workable shape emerges. The result is often enough to suggest a suspect, but rarely enough to convict one. That is the trap. The case begins to point rather than prove. It gestures. It leans. It whispers that someone may already be within view, but it does not yet speak loudly enough to close around him. In that atmosphere, certain suspects inevitably draw disproportionate attention. A man with the right appearance and a strange history. A local figure whose movements do not quite line up. Someone with prior accusations, prior access. Prior moments of odd behavior that never amounted to chargeable crimes. Detectives investigate them because they must. Each time they do, the case seems to narrow for a moment. Then a detail collapses the theory. The timing does not work. The witness loses certainty. The car does not match after all. The alibi survives. The search shifts again. This repeated narrowing and reopening creates the emotional shape of the dead end. It is not inactivity. It is motion without capture. It is the repeated experience of almost touching the right answer and coming away with nothing solid in the hand. For the actual killer, this phase likely reinforced his sense of superiority. Organized offenders often interpret investigative delay not as luck, but as proof of their own cleverness. Every day uncaught becomes an argument in favor of their private mythology. They begin to believe not only that they can do what they have done, but that they can keep doing it because the people tasked with stopping them are always one step behind. That belief may sharpen their methods. It may also make them careless in subtle ways, not careless enough to collapse immediately, but careless enough to leave patterns. Confidence is often what eventually betrays a serial offender. Yet before it betrays him, it usually protects him by giving him the composure to keep moving through public life as if nothing in him has changed. The investigation into a man like this, therefore, becomes more than a search for physical evidence. It becomes a search for fracture, for the place where the performance slips. Detectives begin looking at lifestyle, habits, mobility, personal history, emotional relationships. Abrupt disappearances, shifts in behavior around known dates. They ask whether the suspect likes to control conversation, whether he overexplains, whether he seems too interested in the case, whether he has the kind of confidence that treats suspicion as a temporary inconvenience rather than a threat. But again, these are psychological impressions. Useful, sometimes, but dangerous if they harden too quickly into certainty. Good investigators know that suspicion is not proof. Great investigators also know that waiting too long for perfect proof can cost lives. That tension defines the investigative dead end better than anything else. Move too cautiously, and the offender remains free. Move too aggressively, and the case can collapse around the wrong man, poisoning the search for the real one. The national atmosphere around such crimes complicates things further. As stories spread, pressure rises. Reporters call. Editors want developments. The public wants reassurance. Supervisors want progress. Politicians want competence displayed. All of that pressure hits the people at the center of the file, the detectives staring at maps, interview notes, sketches, call logs, and lab reports that still refuse to become a solved case. The temptation under pressure is to impose a cleaner story than the evidence actually allows, to force coherence, to declare certainty where only probability exists. But cases like this punish for certainty. They require patience even when patience feels morally intolerable. Because every day patience lasts, there is the possibility of another victim. And every detective knows it. That knowledge haunts the dead-end phase. It is not just failure in an abstract sense. It is failure measured against future harm. Somewhere, perhaps on a campus, perhaps by a road, perhaps in a park bright with the false innocence of summer, another woman may still be moving through her day toward an encounter no one has yet prevented. That possibility turns paperwork into urgency. It turns sleeplessness into obligation. It turns every unresolved suspect into a threat shadowing the next ordinary afternoon. Part 6 is therefore the investigation at its most painful. Not the beginning, where confusion at least has innocence behind it, and not the breakthrough, where evidence starts finally to lock into place, but the long center, where patterns are visible and capture is not. It is the stage where investigators know enough to be frightened and not enough to be done. It is the stage where the case acquires suspects but not justice,